AM 1460, the new WXBR. You are listening to the Metro South Morning Show. Peter Czymbor here with you on this Friday morning. Joining me right now via the telephone is a man who is the founding member, or one of the founding members, of the legendary thrash metal band Megadeth. He is currently rounding out a North American tour with that band in support of their most recent album, Super Collider. His autobiography, My Life with Deth, is available in stores right now and on Amazon.com and websites of the like. We welcome into the program David Ellefson. David, good morning and welcome to the program.
Hey, how are you? Thank you.
I'm doing excellent, David. I'm noticing somewhat of a trend in recent years. It was Rex from Pantera who I think started this, and you're continuing it. The bass players and bands are writing memoirs now, and people are interested.
Yeah, it's, I guess I always try to think back to who was the first one who actually started this. And I know, as we played a show with Slash this summer, and to me, he was probably one of the first ones of our age group and genre to write a book. And he had mentioned to me, he said, I basically wrote my book because there was so much stuff around Guns N' Roses, I felt I had to sort of straighten the facts out. Even I guess before that, I remember David Lee Roth wrote a book. And I always liked this book because I never did read it cover to cover, and I actually never finished it. But Roth's book was this style that it was like a tabletop book. It literally sat on my table in my living room, and I would pick it up from time to time, and you could pick it up anywhere in the book and start reading it, and it just had these really funny, fascinating stories. So as I wrote my book and we did the final edits, I wanted mine to be a lot like David Lee Roth's, where you could just pick it up at any given time, or you could read it top to bottom, but either way, it would be an entertaining and informative read.
My favorite quote that David Lee Roth gave about his very own book was he said he read a review where someone said it tends to ramble. And he said, tends? I mean, the whole thing. He was just going story after story, going into great detail, sometimes getting so deep into the details you forgot what the original story was at times. Your book like that or no?
No, definitely not. I because I've written a book before. Back in the late 90s, I published a book called Making Music Your Business, A Guide for Young Musicians. And it's essentially a how-to book from someone like me who's been through the ringer in the music business, writing to other musicians looking to get into the business. I've been through the process of writing, editing, and finally publishing and getting a book to market. And I already knew that it's about a 3-year timeline. And I also know what it's like to get your thoughts on paper, which is the rambling. And it's sometimes very hard to discern a story out of it. And then going through the very painstaking detail of editing to really shape the story. And in this case with My Life with Deth was actually, that process was much easier because Joel MacGyver, my co-writer on this, he has written some of these books before, so he's was very good at saying today we're going to do an hour interview over Skype, and we're going to talk about these years of your life, and then we're going to talk about this. So we did about 30 sessions, 31-hour sessions over Skype, where he basically interviewed me, and then we got the stuff on paper. So he was very detailed about the chronological order and really laying out the 49 years of my life. And then from there, we went into a more detailed editing process.
I want to delve into the subject matter of that book you wrote in the late 90s on the music business in just a little bit, but right now we'll stick with talking about your current book, which is on stores now, My Life with Deth. Once again, we're talking with David Ellefson, the bass player for Megadeth here on AM 1460. You mentioned David Lee Roth's book, and you mentioned Slash's book when you were talking about books from musical artists of your generation which inspired you that you could write a memoir and people would be interested. The reason why I brought up the Rex Brown book from Pantera at the top of the interview is because you take a look at bands like Van Halen and Guns N' Roses, who you mentioned, very heavy, hard-rocking bands. At the same time, they're bands that had gargantuan mainstream appeal. And while Megadeth certainly had their following and had some platinum and many, many gold albums, you guys never reached that mainstream gargantuan status of Guns N' Roses and Van Halen. And the trend that I was seeing over the past few years with Rex's book and now your book is that, you know what, these really heavy metal bands, guess what, their fans read. They're not as dumb as people may have thought.
That's a good point, and I'm glad you said that. And kudos to you for acknowledging that, because I think that's something that we've always championed at Megadeth, is that because we have long hair, because we like to, listen to loud, heavy music, does not mean that we're idiots. Don't judge the book by its cover. No pun intended here. And through, as the reader will see in my book, I did not go to college right out of high school. I instead got in my van and drove to Hollywood, and a week later I met Dave Mustaine. We started Megadeth, and it wasn't until almost 20 years later that I went to college and finished up my 4-year degree. And then I even did a year of seminary through Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, Missouri. So distance and long, and I guess long distance and extended education has been something that I've come to appreciate in my adult life. When I was young was not the time for it. I knew I wanted to go play rock and roll. If I didn't do it, I would have always been frustrated. I would have kicked myself. And I think that really the overarching theme of my book is that we're all wired to do something unique and special in our lives, and we need to go fulfill that. Because if we don't, it will be a constant source of aggravation, frustration, probably failed relationships, and ultimately lead to a lot of unhappiness. And, our Creator put us here to be happy and to be fulfilled and to really, to fulfill that purpose of why we were put here. And I think for me, that's the story that came out of my book. And whether I was playing in a heavy metal band or otherwise, I think as it serves my book, there's this dichotomy that here I am, this guy in this, heavy metal group called Megadeth, yet a lot of these other life lessons have come through that life that I had in rock and roll. And I guess I'm fortunate too, because I'm one of the, one of only a handful who did suffer some, some addictions and various other things that I was very open about. And was able to come through them. And I don't write about them to brag about them, but rather to maybe be an encouraging hope to some other people that may be stuck in those things.
Let's talk about the origins of Megadeth. You are a co-founding member of the band along with Dave Mustaine, who is the lead singer and the guitarist for the band. The story's been told time and time again of Megadeth being created after Dave Mustaine kind of got kicked out of Metallica prior to the release of their debut album, Kill 'Em All, because he had many addictions and whatnot. What are your recollections of meeting Dave Mustaine and starting Megadeth? And how did you meet him?
Well, when I met him, it's funny because I lived in an apartment. Me and my buddy Greg, who had moved to Minnesota together, we lived in an apartment right underneath Dave. And another couple of friends of mine had actually seen Dave in this apartment building and said, "Man, he looks like a cool guy, a rock and roll guy. Maybe we should go try to meet him." And we found out he lived upstairs, and we went to knock on his door and met him. Right away, he had an air of what you would come to expect in a real rock star. Didn't have time for the details and the minute little things of normal everyday life. He was definitely a big picture guy. And I mean, that was just, you could sense that within 30 seconds of being around him. And Hollywood and California at that time, of course, Van Halen had popped out of there and they were hugely successful. This next wave of like Motley Crue and Rat, so these bands were popping out of LA. But of course, with every band that makes it, there's 1,000 other wannabes that didn't, And one thing I could tell right away about Dave is that he was the real deal. And he was a guy who something was going to happen with him. And then when I sat down and we started playing some of his songs, which were the earliest Megadeth songs, you could just feel, man, there is something really different here. And it's very genuine. And it moves you in a way that you would expect a great rock song to move you. And that right away, when I started playing with him, we pretty quickly started to, really develop a chemistry and a style and a sound together. And that's not something that happens every day. Many of your listeners who are musicians probably have played with a bunch of different musicians, and some situations click and a lot of them don't. And the ones that do, you try to hang on to. And I think that's really what the story of Megadeth is between me and Dave, is at all costs hanging on to a creative partnership that really works.
What were some of the early influences in you as a bass player that you had both individually and you had collectively sharing with Dave Mustaine?
Well, I think individually, a guy like Gene Simmons of Kiss. I mean, in my lifetime, Kiss were the Beatles. By the time I started listening to the music, the Beatles were broken up already. And so I missed that whole thing. But to me, bands like Kiss and Cheap Trick and these kind of groups, who by the way pointed to the Beatles as their influences, they really, I think, taught a lot of us of my age group how rock and roll is to be done on a big, massive level. So guys like Gene Simmons, Geddy Lee of Rush, are a couple direct influences to me as bass players and showmen and rock stars, if you will. I think collectively, for me and Dave, we both were really into the new wave of British heavy metal, which would be bands like Iron Maiden, Diamond Head, Def Leppard, groups like that. And there's some other more obscure ones, but I think those groups were the thing we shared together, and it's out of that music that I think was really the direct influence into the Megadeth sound.
Not to get too off topic, but how excited were you to hear earlier this week that Kiss was finally going to get their due and be inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame after years upon years of being snubbed?
I think it's great, and it's. I mean, how can you deny them? I mean, I think by the definition of what the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame deems a nominee to be awarded into the accepted into the Hall of Fame, to be unique, inspirational, all these things. I mean, Kiss is the nth degree of that. They really reinvented rock and roll in my young years growing up. I mean, they put a face to a whole genre. So I just think it's great. It's about time, quite honestly.
Once again, we're chatting with David Ellefson of Megadeth here on AM 1460, the new WXBR. Now, when Megadeth was first getting going, you mentioned bands like Motley Crue and Rat being popular coming out of that LA scene, kind of on the heels of the success that Van Halen had in the late 70s, early 80s. There's a separation within metal between those bands, however. Rat, Motley Crue, seen as party metal, hair metal bands. Megadeth didn't take as big of a presentation to the stage, but a much heavier sound. Was there really any animosity between bands like that, or was that just something that was created amongst the fans back then?
Well, you bring up a really good point, because you're right. When I got there, that was the scene. The Quiet Riot record, Mental Health, was like #1 on the charts, and all these things were blowing up. At the same time, there were bands like Iron Maiden who were really coming into the mainstream, the Scorpions. So some of me and Dave's, influences, those two bands in particular, were starting to have some success, even Accept, to a lesser degree, but also a German group. So the harder metal was definitely making its impression into the mainstream community. I think because Dave had relocated up to San Francisco with Metallica, there's a whole nother scene going on up in San Francisco, which is really thrash metal. LA was mostly known for Sunset Strip, hair metal, like you say, good times, fun, party, rock and roll, heavy metal. Up in the Bay Area was this really hard edge, fast, aggressive metal, and that's why when I met Dave, one of the first things he said, he goes, is this new band we're not going to play any of the clubs in LA. We're going to go straight to San Francisco and debut the band. And I was kind of bummed, honestly, because growing up a kid in Minnesota, and I'd worked around my band through the 2 or 3 state area of Minnesota, Iowa, South Dakota, gigging, playing, and
you saw all the girls.
I ever heard of.
You saw the girls waiting outside to see Poison and said, "I want some of that."
Well, it wasn't. I mean, Poison really, quite honestly, came out the same year we did. The same year, their debut record was the same year Peace Sells, but Who's Buying came out on Capitol Records. So even before that is, to me, all I heard about was the Sunset Strip. I heard about the Starwood and the Roxy and these famous clubs that the likes of Van Halen and these guys had come up through the ranks. And so by the time I got there, Dave's like, we're never playing any of these clubs, and this scene is horrible, and we're moving up. We're not going to move, but we'll live in LA, but we're going to debut in San Francisco. And I tell you what, we about 9 months later, we did our first shows, February and April of 1984. And he was right, man. There was a whole different scene, and the clubs were packed. I mean, we sold out every show we played, and it truly was a totally different scene, and it was much more akin to the new wave of British heavy metal, and because of that, we had this international appeal immediately. We didn't have to start in L.A. and try to build something. By going to San Francisco, the fanzines and the fan support of thrash metal was so strong, we had an instant following throughout Europe, reaching over into Japan and other places around the world. So Megadeth was instantly a global band from day one.
And domestically, throughout the 80s, I think bands like Megadeth and bands that were considered your peers at the time, and perhaps still considered your peers, Metallica, Anthrax, Slayer, you guys were considered somewhat of underground sensations throughout the 80s, but it seems like when the early 90s hit and some of the hair bands started dying out, that's what some of the bands from your particular crop started really getting their biggest mainstream success. Metallica, of course, had the Black Album. I believe you guys had some platinum albums in the early 90s. Anthrax even had some mainstream hits, though they delved in hip-hop a little bit in the early 90s. Did you sense that you guys would have a lot more longevity compared to some of the bands that started when you originated around the time of the mid to early 90s?
Yeah, and I'll say this just from a factual point of view, not from a bragging point of view, but I knew the day I met Dave and we were starting Megadeth, this band was going to be big. And I knew it was going to be far-reaching, and I knew it was not an overnight sensation. And a lot of people may say, dude, you're crazy, and, you know, what an arrogant statement to make. But I tell you, when we started this band, I knew this band was going to make it big, you know, and I had a feeling that it was not going to be some big, you know, overnight sensation. It was going to be a lot of hard work, which it has been. But it's something that, you know, as we're on the phone talking today, 30 years into Megadeth, you know, here we are. And, you know, there's something to be said for being able to see something through to the end and also have it go to the end rather than just being here today, gone later today, which is what a lot of that stuff was when in the late 80s and the early 90s it was flash-in-the-pan stuff.
We're chatting with David Ellefson of Megadeth, talking about his autobiography, My Life with Deth, which is available now. David, you mentioned earlier in the interview that you had some experience with the publishing industry in the late 90s when you wrote a book on the music industry and the business itself. Let's talk about how the business has changed since Megadeth began. Back in the early 80s, Megadeth had to play shows, tour to get their name out, and everything was really oriented towards albums. Nowadays, a lot of bands can get exposure without touring through social media, the internet, and things of that nature, and people more or less are buying individual songs on iTunes with rare exception at this point. Do you like where the music industry has gone, or is it just something you must accept?
I think to a large degree it's something you must accept. You know, a lot of things, you know, the internet has changed everything, not just music, but it's changed how we shop, it's changed how we get our media, our entertainment, our news. I mean, newspapers, you know, print newspaper, print magazine, print media is dying now the same way that the record industry died 10 years ago because of the internet revolution. But, you know, the entertainment business, it's always been a young man's game. And, you know, you either get hip to it and you roll with it, or you kind of just get antiquated and flushed out. And, you know, Megadeth has always been a band who has embraced technology right from the very beginning. In fact, we were the very first band ever to have a worldwide website. Capitol Records in 1994 built a site for us called Megadeth Arizona, and they spent a ton of money and a ton of just effort into the infrastructure of it. And as a result, you know, that gave us a foot ahead of everybody with the web. And you know, as a result, you know, Megadeth.com, our official site, plus all of our own individual sites and Twitters and social media and Facebook and everything that we have, you know, we're a band that has really embraced that as a way to communicate with our fans, because it goes back to what we just talked about. When we came to San Francisco to play our first shows, there was this grassroots fan base and fanzine, magazine-driven culture that, quite honestly, is exactly what the internet is today.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you wrote that book on the music business in the late 90s because people were writing to you looking for advice on how to go about getting into the music business and be successful. Well, let's take the advice you gave them in the late 90s. Let's transfer it to 2013 as we head into 2014. Someone says to you right now, hey, I'm starting a band. I think we've got something good going. What do I do to get our music out there? What do you say?
Well, there's a couple things. I think exposure is always the thing. When you're a band like Megadeth, you want to limit your exposure, or at least manage your exposure, I should say, because you don't want to overexpose in certain areas, and you don't want to be underexposed. So that we're at a different level. But in the beginning, you need to just get your name out there and be out there playing. And I think much the same way Dave had a strategy. It isn't so much how much you play, it's when and where. Be strategic about it. Do events, play shows, be part of things that give you perception, because perception is 90% of this game. You're either perceived as an average band or you're perceived as a great band, and that perception is really what you're trying to sell.
Now, you mentioned earlier that within a week of meeting Dave Mustaine, you guys had really started the beginnings of Megadeth. You also talked a little bit earlier that your book, My Life with Deth, which is available now, deals with some addictions you've had throughout the duration of your life. It's been well documented that Dave Mustaine, one of the main reasons he was kicked out of Metallica in the early 80s, which led to him forming Megadeth, was because of rampant alcoholism, which is kind of unique. If you know the story of Metallica in the early 80s, all the guys were drinking heavily at that time. What addictions have you faced throughout the course of your life and career with Megadeth? How did you overcome them? And how did the environment of being on the road with all these rock and roll bands kind of influence that?
Well, for me, I started playing. Again, my book, I think what I really wanted to do initially is really lay out my early life as a young child growing up on the farm in Minnesota. There's this very wholesome, work ethic based, church on Sunday, saying prayers at every meal. That was the world I grew up in, and it was very wholesome. It was very honest. It had a lot of integrity. And I get into playing music just for the love of it and putting bands together. And by nature, because I was a young bass player and I got good at it pretty good, I was always kind of called up to play with older guys. Well, older guys were, smoking dope and drinking and doing the stuff that, a lot of teenagers do, and especially guys with rock and roll star aspirations. And so I was in and around it from a pretty early age. But by age 15 is when I started to participate in it, and it started with alcohol, and it led in, by the end of it, when I got cleaned up by the time I was age 25, led me down into heroin and cocaine and all that other stuff, but and that's the nature of it. And then, look, they told us that in our high school health class. Don't drink. If you don't start, you won't end up at the bottom. But if you start, you might end up at the bottom, and that's exactly what happened to me. And certainly, being in the entertainment business, back in those days, the entertainment business sort of applauded decadence, and it applauded, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But there was a point by the early '90s, late '80s, and really late '80s, where even the music business was like, look, we're not going to put up with this stuff anymore. There's millions of dollars on the table. There's a lot of people that have a lot at stake with the record companies and concert promoters. And, we're tired of guys being too messed up to keep their commitments and missing shows and botching up deals, So there really became this trend, even in the entertainment business, where guys were getting clean and they were getting sobered up, which is when my life transitions happened. And the good news is I've been clear-headed ever since then, ever since 1990. So I had the best years of my career, both personally and with Megadeth. And, it's led to family and stability and other things outside of rock and roll. And those are the things, quite honestly, the disciplines that I do, both at home and out here on the road, are the things that keep my life in ballast.
Now, another renowned rocker who went from being an alcoholic and having many addictions to being clean and sober is Alice Cooper, who actually writes the foreword to your book. How cool is that?
And that's exactly why I reached out to him, because he took us out on our first big arena tour back in, I guess, 1987, I think it was, on our P. Cells Who's Buying record. For him, it was the Constrictor tour, and he was rebuilding his career. He had just come out of his dark days with alcohol and had converted to Christianity and was, getting his life together. And so he's, not only was a sort of a father figure to Megadeth, both personally and professionally, but, many years later when I wrote this book, I thought, man, Alice was a guy right there from the beginning that really put a lot of wind in our sails with Megadeth, and also, again, was really this like mentor to us as well.
Well, David, we're actually running out of time, but I would love to speak with you again at some point. I want to remind our listeners that the book is My Life with Deth. It's the memoir of David Ellefson, the bass player for Megadeth. The most recent album, Super Collider, is in stores now. And David, any final words for our listeners before I let you go this morning?
Well, first of all, happy holidays to everybody. And, I'm actually glad my book came out right at this time of the year. I've gotten a lot of just really great feedback from it. And hopefully it's a fun read. It's entertaining. But also I hope that, some of my struggles and subsequent triumphs through some trying times, will hopefully be something that'll be inspiring to people. So, maybe the book makes a nice little stocking stuffer for the holiday season.
Well, I'll be sure to check it out, and I encourage our listeners to as well. That is David Ellefson of Megadeth joining us here on AM 1460, the new WXBR. We'll step aside for a quick break. Mike Pava joins us with a local news update.